The grand ballroom of the Hotel del Coronado sparkled under crystal chandeliers as the Navy's most distinguished officers gathered for the annual Leadership Conference Gala. Admiral Sarah Chen stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, her dress blues impeccable as always, watching the Pacific waves crash against the shore in the distance. At 42, she commanded respect wherever she went. Her record spoke for itself, her decisions were surgical in their precision, and her ability to lead under pressure had saved countless lives during her deployments. But tonight felt different. There was electricity in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the storm brewing outside. Sarah could sense the whispers following her as she moved through the crowd. She'd heard them before, comments about how she'd risen too fast, questions about whether she truly deserved her position, suggestions that perhaps her success came from something other than merit. Admiral Chen. The voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. She turned to face Rear Admiral Marcus Webb, a man whose career had peaked a decade ago and whose bitterness had only grown with time. His face wore the smug expression she'd come to recognize whenever he was preparing to make someone's evening unpleasant. "Rear Admiral Webb," she replied, her voice steady and professional despite the warning bells going off in her mind. Around them, conversations quieted as other officers sensed the approaching confrontation. Webb stepped closer, his voice carrying just enough volume to ensure the nearby group could hear every word. "I was just telling Captain Morrison here about your recent promotion. Quite remarkable, really. Some of us took 25 years to reach flag rank, but you've managed it in just 15. His tone suggested anything but admiration. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came whenever someone questioned her achievements, but her expression remained neutral. "Hard work and dedication tend to pay off, Admiral. As I'm sure you remember from your own rise through the ranks." Of course, Webb continued, his smile growing more predatory. "Though I have to wonder, and, please, correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you have some rather influential mentors along the way? Admiral Patterson, for instance, seemed quite invested in your career development during your time at the Pentagon." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. Sarah felt every eye in the immediate vicinity turn toward her, waiting to see how she would respond to what was essentially an accusation that she'd slept her way to the top. Her hands remained steady at her sides, though inside, her heart hammered against her ribs. "Admiral Patterson was an excellent mentor," she said carefully, as were many others who recognized potential and chose to develop it. "Just as I now mentor young officers who show promise, regardless of their gender." Webb's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, I'm sure you're very good at mentoring, Admiral. Very hands-on, one might say." Several officers shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the conversation had crossed from professional disagreement into something uglier. Captain Morrison, who had been standing nearby, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the evening's agenda." No, Webb interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. "I think this is exactly what we should be discussing. After all, the Navy's integrity depends on ensuring that promotions are based on merit alone, doesn't it, Admiral Chen? We can't have people thinking that certain accommodations were made." Sarah felt the familiar cold anger that had sustained her through countless battles, both literal and metaphorical. It was the same fury that had driven her through the Naval Academy when instructors told her women didn't belong on submarines. The same steel that had kept her standing when she'd been the only woman in strategic planning meetings where colleagues spoke over her or ignored her input entirely. "I'm curious, Rear Admiral," she said, her voice dropping to a quieter register that somehow commanded more attention than shouting would have. "Are you suggesting that my 3 combat deployments, my doctorate in strategic studies, my perfect fitness reports, and my successful command of the USS Intrepid were all somehow fabricated? Or are you simply uncomfortable with the possibility that a woman might genuinely be better at this job than you are?" The crowd around them had grown larger now, sensing the confrontation escalating. Webb's face flushed red, and Sarah could see she'd struck a nerve. His promotion to Rear Admiral had been his ceiling, everyone knew it, and everyone knew why. His lack of innovation, his tendency to micromanage, and his inability to adapt to changing military realities had stalled his career years ago. "Better?" Webb scoffed, his voice rising. "You want to talk about better? Let's talk about your precious submarine command. 3 months in the Persian Gulf, And what did you accomplish? A routine patrol that any competent officer could have handled. But the press made it sound like you'd single-handedly won the war because they love a good story about breaking glass ceilings. That routine patrol involved navigating unprecedented diplomatic tensions with Iran while maintaining strategic positioning for 3 carrier groups, Sarah replied, her voice still eerily calm. It required split-second decisions that prevented what could have escalated into an international incident. But, I suppose you're right, any competent officer could have done it. The key word being competent. A few suppressed chuckles rippled through the crowd, and Webb's face grew even redder. He stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell the alcohol on his breath. You think you're so superior, don't you? Walking around here like you own the place, like you've earned the right to look down on officers who've served longer than you've been alive. I don't look down on anyone, Admiral, Sarah said, still not backing away despite Webb now standing uncomfortably close. I simply expect the same level of professionalism from others that I demand from myself. Something that seems to be in short supply this evening. Professionalism? Webb's voice cracked with indignation. You want to lecture me about professionalism? You, who's turned the Navy into some kind of social experiment. You, who thinks that just because you look good in a uniform, you can waltz in and, that's enough. The new voice belonged to Admiral Harrison, Webb's superior and one of the most respected leaders in the Navy. He'd approached quietly, but his presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. Rear Admiral Webb, I think you've had enough to drink for one evening. But Webb was beyond reason now, his years of resentment and wounded pride spilling out in a torrent of barely contained rage. Oh, here comes another one of her champions, he sneered. How convenient. You all just can't help yourselves, can you? One pretty face in a uniform and, suddenly, everyone's tripping over themselves to Admiral Webb. Sarah's voice cut through his rant like a whip crack. You're embarrassing yourself and dishonoring your uniform. I suggest you remember where you are and who you're speaking to. The reminder seemed to penetrate Webb's alcohol-fueled haze for a moment, and he looked around at the crowd of officers watching the spectacle with expressions ranging from disgust to embarrassment. But, instead of backing down, he seemed to double down on his attack. Dishonoring my uniform, he repeated, his voice thick with sarcasm. That's rich, coming from someone who's made a mockery of everything this institution stands for. You think just because you've got everyone fooled with your perfect little act, your pressed uniforms and your politically correct speeches, that you belong here? Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. This had gone far beyond professional disagreement or even personal animosity. This was character assassination, played out in front of her peers and subordinates. Every word Webb spoke was designed to undermine her authority, her competence, and her right to wear the uniform she'd earned through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I think, she said quietly, that my record speaks for itself. And I think that anyone who needs to tear down others to feel better about their own shortcomings reveals more about themselves than about their targets. Webb's eyes blazed with fury at the calm dismissal. Your record? Your precious record built on the backs of real warriors who did the actual fighting while you played politics in Washington. You want to talk about records? Let's talk about the fact that you've never seen real combat, never had to make the hard choices that I've seen plenty of combat, Sarah interrupted, her voice still level but carrying an edge now that made several officers take an involuntary step back. I've been shot at, I've returned fire, and I've brought my people home. Every single time. But, more importantly, I've spent my career preparing for the wars we hope never to fight, making the strategic decisions that keep conflicts from escalating in the first place. That's what flag officers do, Admiral. We think beyond the next engagement. The crowd had grown silent now, sensing that the confrontation had reached a crucial moment. Webb swayed slightly on his feet, his face a mottled purple with rage and alcohol. Think? You call what you do thinking? Following orders, checking boxes, making sure you look good for the cameras? Real leadership isn't about looking pretty in a uniform, sweetheart. It's about the word hung in the air like a slap. Sweetheart. The diminutive that reduced everything Sarah had accomplished, every battle she'd fought, every barrier she'd broken, to nothing more than her gender. The crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that Webb had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Admiral Harrison stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. "Admiral Webb, you are relieved from this event. Security will escort you to your quarters, where you will remain until we can discuss your conduct in private." But Webb wasn't finished. Fueled by years of resentment and the liquid courage flowing through his system, he turned to face the crowd directly, his voice rising to ensure everyone could hear. "You all see it, don't you? The way she manipulates situations, the way she uses her position to silence anyone who dares to question her? This is what happens when we lower standards, when we prioritize politics over competence." Sarah stood perfectly still as the accusations washed over her, her training taking over. In combat, emotions could get you killed. In leadership, they could destroy your credibility. She'd learned long ago to compartmentalize, to maintain her composure even when everything inside her wanted to scream. "Admiral Webb," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent ballroom, "you're entitled to your opinions about my qualifications, my performance, and my right to wear this uniform. But you're not entitled to disrespect the institution we both serve or the people who've served alongside me. Your behavior tonight reflects poorly on the Navy and on yourself." Webb laughed bitterly. "My behavior? My behavior? You think standing here letting everyone see you for what you really are is somehow noble? You think your calm little act impresses anyone? We all know what this is really about. You've gotten by on excuses and special treatment your entire career, and now your excuses?" Sarah's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity, as if Webb had just said something fascinating rather than insulting. "What excuses would those be, exactly?" Webb gestured wildly, his movements becoming more erratic. "Oh, where do I start? The diversity quotas, the lowered physical standards, the special accommodations. The way you've all been handed opportunities that real officers had to fight for. You want to know what I think?" I think, Sarah interrupted quietly, "that you've said more than enough." But Webb was beyond stopping now. The alcohol, the audience, and the years of perceived injustice had combined into a perfect storm of poor judgment. "No, I don't think I have. I think it's time someone finally told the truth around here. You're not qualified for this position, you're not ready for the responsibility, and you certainly don't have the experience to." His words cut off abruptly as Admiral Harrison's security detail appeared at his shoulders. But the damage had been done. Every person in that ballroom had witnessed a senior officer publicly attempt to destroy a colleague's reputation based on nothing more than gender bias and personal resentment. Sarah stood motionless as Webb was escorted away, his voice still carrying back to the crowd as he continued his rant even while being removed. She could feel every eye in the room on her, weighing her response, judging her reaction. Some faces showed sympathy, others curiosity, and a few displayed the kind of satisfaction that came from watching drama unfold. Admiral Harrison approached her, his expression grave. "Admiral Chen, I apologize for that display. Admiral Webb's behavior was completely inappropriate and does not reflect the values of this institution." Sarah nodded, her composure still intact despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Thank you, Admiral Harrison. Though I should point out that Admiral Webb's opinions, while unprofessionally expressed, are probably shared by more people than we'd like to admit." "Perhaps," Harrison replied carefully, "but that doesn't make them valid or acceptable." The crowd around them began to disperse, conversations resuming in hushed tones as people processed what they'd witnessed. Sarah knew that within hours, accounts of the confrontation would spread throughout the naval community, each retelling probably adding new details and interpretations. Captain Morrison approached, his expression embarrassed. "Admiral, I want to apologize for not intervening sooner. That was completely unacceptable." "Don't apologize, Captain," Sarah replied. "Admiral Webb needed to reveal who he really is. Better it happened here, in front of witnesses, than in a closed-door meeting where his accusations could be whispered and spread without accountability." As the evening continued, Sarah found herself surrounded by colleagues offering support, but she could also sense the underlying tension. Webb's accusations had given voice to doubts that others harbored but had never expressed so publicly. She knew that some people would see her calm response as evidence of strength, while others might interpret it as evidence that the accusations had merit. Later that evening, as the formal dinner portion of the gala began, Sarah excused herself to step outside onto the hotel's oceanfront terrace. The cool Pacific breeze was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside, and she finally allowed herself to breathe deeply for the first time since the confrontation began. The stars were brilliant overhead, unobscured by the lights of the hotel, and Sarah found herself thinking about all the nights she'd stood watch on various ships, looking up at those same stars while carrying the weight of command. The responsibilities, the decisions, the constant awareness that people's lives depended on her judgment, none of that had ever felt as heavy as the simple act of standing in a ballroom while someone tried to strip away her dignity. She heard footsteps behind her and turned to see Admiral Harrison approaching, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He offered one to her without speaking, and they stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the waves. 30 years, he finally said. 30 years I've been in this Navy, and I still see things that surprise me. Good surprises or bad ones? Sarah asked. Both, he admitted. Tonight was definitely in the bad category. But your response, that was something else entirely. Most officers would have either lost their temper or backed down. You did neither. Sarah sipped her coffee, considering his words. Losing my temper would have proven his point. Backing down would have validated his accusations. The only option was to stand there and let him reveal his true character. Easier said than done, Harrison observed. Especially when every word is designed to provoke a response. I've had practice, Sarah said simply. They stood in silence again, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah knew that the evening's events would have consequences that extended far beyond her personal reputation. The Navy was evolving, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, but the kind of attitudes Webb had displayed were increasingly out of step with institutional values. The investigation will be thorough, Harrison said eventually. There were too many witnesses for this to be swept under the rug, and, frankly, I wouldn't want it to be. This kind of behavior has no place in our Navy. Sarah nodded, but part of her wondered if an investigation would really change anything. Webb would probably face some form of disciplinary action, maybe even early retirement, but the attitudes that had driven his outburst would remain. They'd just be expressed more carefully, more privately, in ways that were harder to challenge or address. Admiral, Harrison said, his tone becoming more formal, I want you to know that you have my complete support. Your record speaks for itself, and tonight only reinforced my conviction that you're exactly the kind of officer this Navy needs moving forward. Thank you, Sarah replied. That means more than you know. As Harrison headed back inside to manage the fallout from the evening's events, Sarah remained on the terrace, processing everything that had happened. She thought about the young female officers who had been in that crowd, watching to see how she would handle such a direct attack on her competence and integrity. She hoped they'd seen that dignity and professionalism were more powerful weapons than anger or defensiveness. But, beneath her calm exterior, Sarah felt the familiar exhaustion that came from constantly having to prove herself worthy of positions she'd already earned. Every success was scrutinized more carefully than her male counterparts, every mistake magnified, every decision questioned not just for its merits but for what it revealed about women's fitness for command. The wind picked up, carrying the salt spray from the waves breaking below. Sarah closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, a reminder of why she'd fallen in love with the Navy in the first place. The ocean was honest, it didn't care about your gender, your politics, or your personal opinions. It demanded respect, competence, and careful judgment, and it rewarded those qualities without prejudice. When she finally returned to the ballroom, the evening was winding down. Several officers approached her throughout the remainder of the event, some offering support, others engaging in carefully neutral conversation that avoided any reference to the earlier confrontation. Sarah handled each interaction with the same professional grace she'd maintained throughout the evening. As she prepared to leave, Captain Jennifer Walsh, one of the few other female flag officers present, approached her near the coat check. Sarah, she said quietly, how are you holding up? I'm fine, Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself. Actually, I'm angry. But I'm handling it. Jennifer nodded understandingly. We all are. What Webb said tonight, it wasn't just about you. It was about all of us, every woman who's ever put on this uniform. I know, Sarah said. That's what made it so important to handle it the right way. And, you did, Jennifer assured her. You absolutely did. As Sarah retrieved her coat and prepared to head back to her quarters, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. She'd come to the gala expecting a routine evening of networking and professional socializing. Instead, she'd found herself at the center of a confrontation that would likely define how many people viewed her for years to come. But, as she walked through the hotel lobby toward the exit, Sarah held her head high. She'd faced down enemies in combat zones and bureaucratic obstacles in Washington. She'd overcome discrimination and exceeded expectations at every level of her career. Tonight had been just another battle in a war she'd been fighting since the day she first put on a Naval Academy uniform. And, like all the battles before it, she'd emerged with her integrity intact and her mission clear, to serve her country with distinction and to pave the way for the officers who would follow in her footsteps. The fact that some people couldn't see past her gender to recognize her qualifications was their limitation, not hers. The cool night air felt refreshing after the stifling atmosphere of the ballroom. As Sarah walked toward her car, she allowed herself a small smile. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove herself, and probably new versions of the same old prejudices she'd been fighting her entire career. But tonight had proven something important, not just to the officers who witnessed the confrontation, but to herself. She was strong enough to stand firm in the face of personal attacks, professional enough to maintain her composure under pressure, and confident enough in her abilities to let her record speak for itself. Webb had called her accomplishments excuses, had suggested she'd advanced based on special treatment rather than merit. But, as Sarah drove through the quiet streets of San Diego, she knew the truth that no amount of criticism could diminish. She'd earned every rank, every position, and every responsibility through dedication, skill, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The real test, she knew, would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the naval community processed what had happened and formed their own opinions about the confrontation. Some would see Webb's behavior as an isolated incident, while others might view it as a symptom of larger institutional problems. But, regardless of how others interpreted the evening's events, Sarah was certain of one thing: she would continue to serve with distinction, to lead with integrity, and to demonstrate through her actions that competence and character mattered more than gender or politics. The Navy was changing, slowly but surely, and she intended to be part of that transformation rather than a casualty of it. The following morning brought a deluge of messages to Admiral Sarah Chen's phone. Text messages from colleagues, emails from superiors, and several voicemails from journalists who had somehow already gotten wind of the previous evening's confrontation. Sarah sat in her quarters at Naval Base San Diego, still in her workout clothes after an early morning run along the bay, scrolling through the communications with growing unease. The official naval messaging was predictably cautious expressions of support wrapped in careful language that avoided taking definitive positions. But the unofficial channels told a different story. Social media posts from officers who had been present were already spreading across military networks, each account slightly different from the others, some more sympathetic to her position, others questioning whether she'd somehow provoked the confrontation. Her aide, Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez, knocked and entered with a steaming cup of coffee and a tablet loaded with the morning's intelligence briefings. Admiral Harrison's office called. He'd like to see you at 0900 for what he's calling an informal discussion about last night. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully. Any word on Admiral Webb's status? He's been placed on administrative leave pending a formal investigation, Rodriguez replied. The preliminary interviews start this afternoon. Sarah nodded, though she felt no satisfaction at the news. Webb's career was effectively over even if the investigation cleared him of any formal wrongdoing, which seemed unlikely given the number of witnesses. His outburst had revealed attitudes that were incompatible with modern naval leadership. But his destruction wouldn't undo the damage his words had done or address the underlying issues his accusations had exposed. Rodriguez, she said, I want you to compile a comprehensive review of my service record, deployments, fitness reports, commendations, everything. If people are going to question my qualifications, I want the facts readily available. Yes, ma'am. Though if I may say so, Admiral, anyone who questions your qualifications hasn't been paying attention. Sarah smiled at the young officer's loyalty, but she knew the situation was more complicated than that. It wasn't really about her qualifications, it was about the persistent belief in some quarters that women in combat roles were aberrations, social experiments that weakened military readiness rather than enhanced it. She spent the next hour reviewing the intelligence briefings, forcing herself to focus on the strategic challenges facing the Pacific Fleet rather than dwelling on personal concerns. The geopolitical situation was complex enough without adding internal military politics to the mix, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the previous evening's events would have consequences that extended far beyond her own reputation. At precisely 0900, Sarah arrived at Admiral Harrison's office in the headquarters building. His assistant waved her through immediately, and she found Harrison standing by his window, looking out at the harbor where several destroyers were moored alongside the pier. "Sarah," he greeted her, "thank you for coming. Please, have a seat." She settled into one of the leather chairs facing his desk, noting that he remained standing, a positioning choice that suggested this would be a more serious conversation than she'd anticipated. "I've been on the phone since 0600, Harrison began, with everyone from the Chief of Naval Operations to the Secretary of the Navy. Last night's incident has generated significant attention at the highest levels of the Department of Defense." "I imagine it has," Sarah replied carefully. Harrison turned to face her directly. "The consensus is that Admiral Webb's behavior was completely unacceptable and will be addressed accordingly. But there are concerns about the broader implications of this incident." Sarah felt a familiar tightening in her chest. "What kind of concerns?" "The kind that arise whenever issues of gender equality in the military make headlines," Harrison said bluntly. "There are people in Washington who see this as an opportunity to advance their agendas, and others who view it as a threat to military effectiveness. Neither group is particularly interested in the facts." Sarah had expected this. Military controversies had a way of being co-opted by political interests that cared more about advancing their positions than addressing the underlying issues. "What's the official position?" "The official position is that the Navy remains committed to equal opportunity and that Admiral Webb's comments don't represent institutional values," Harrison replied. "But, unofficially, there's concern that this incident could be used to question broader policies regarding women in combat roles." "So the solution is to make me disappear quietly?" Sarah asked, though her tone remained professional. Harrison shook his head firmly. "Not if I have anything to say about it. Your record is exemplary, your leadership is beyond question, and this Navy needs officers like you. But I'd be lying if I said there weren't people who see this differently." Sarah appreciated his honesty, even as she recognized the precarious position it placed her in. She'd become a symbol rather than simply an officer, and symbols were often sacrificed to preserve institutional stability. "Admiral," she said, "I need you to understand something. I didn't ask for last night to happen, but I'm not going to apologize for how I handled it. If standing up to prejudice and maintaining my dignity under attack makes me a controversial figure, then so be it." Harrison smiled for the first time since she'd entered his office. "I wouldn't expect anything else from you. In fact, that's exactly the attitude that's going to get us through this." They spent the next hour discussing the investigation process, media strategy, and the various briefings Sarah would need to attend over the coming days. It quickly became clear that the incident had triggered a comprehensive review not just of Webb's conduct, but of broader issues related to gender integration in the Navy's senior leadership ranks. "There's something else," Harrison said as their meeting concluded. "The CNO wants to meet with you personally when he's in San Diego next week. He specifically requested a detailed briefing on your perspective regarding women in naval leadership." Sarah nodded, though she wondered whether this was an opportunity or a trap. Being asked to represent all women in naval service was a burden she'd never sought, but it was one that had been thrust upon her regardless of her preferences. As she left Harrison's office, Sarah encountered Captain Morrison in the corridor. He'd been present during Webb's tirade and had attempted to intervene, though unsuccessfully. His expression was apologetic as he approached her. Admiral Chen, he said, I wanted to personally apologize for not doing more to stop Admiral Webb's behavior last night. It was completely inappropriate. Captain, Sarah replied, you tried to redirect the conversation. Admiral Webb was determined to have his say regardless of any intervention. Morrison nodded, but his expression remained troubled. I've been in this Navy for 22 years, and I've never seen anything quite like that. The level of personal animosity, the complete disregard for professional courtesy, it was shocking. Sarah appreciated his support, but she recognized that Morrison's shock revealed how insulated many male officers were from the kinds of challenges she faced regularly. What seemed aberrant to him was simply a more extreme version of attitudes she'd encountered throughout her career. Captain, she said, I'm curious about something. In your opinion, do Admiral Webb's views represent a significant portion of the officer corps, or was last night an isolated incident? Morrison considered the question carefully. I'd like to say it was isolated, but I think that would be naive. There are definitely officers who question whether the integration of women into combat roles has been handled properly. Most are professional enough to keep their opinions private, but the attitudes are there. It was an honest answer, and Sarah respected him for giving it. The Navy was changing, but institutional transformation was always a gradual process, complicated by entrenched interests and genuine concerns about military effectiveness. That afternoon, Sarah attended the first of what would be many interviews related to the investigation. The process was thorough and professional, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being scrutinized as much as Webb was. Every decision she'd made, every interaction she'd had with colleagues, every aspect of her career was being examined for evidence that might either support or undermine the accusations he'd made. The investigating officer, Captain Angela Torres, was meticulous in her questioning. She walked Sarah through the events of the previous evening multiple times, examining not just what had been said but how it had been said, the context that had led to the confrontation, and the reactions of the officers who had witnessed it. Admiral Chen, Torres said during one particularly detailed exchange, some witnesses have suggested that Admiral Webb's behavior might have been triggered by professional disagreements rather than gender bias. Can you think of any specific incidents that might support that interpretation? Sarah considered the question carefully. She could think of several occasions when she and Webb had disagreed on policy matters, strategic decisions, and resource allocation. But she'd had similar disagreements with dozens of other officers over the years without triggering the kind of personal attack she'd experienced. Captain Torres, she finally replied, Admiral Webb and I have disagreed on professional matters, as do most officers at various points in their careers. But those disagreements were always resolved through normal channels and never involved personal attacks or questions about my fundamental qualifications for service. Last night was qualitatively different. Torres nodded, making notes on her tablet. Can you elaborate on what made it different? The language he used, the implications he made about my character and competence, and the fact that he chose to make those accusations publicly rather than through official channels, Sarah explained. Professional disagreements don't typically involve suggestions that someone has slept their way to the top or accusations that they're fundamentally unqualified for their position. The interview continued for another hour, covering every aspect of her relationship with Webb and the broader context of gender relations within the Navy's senior leadership. Sarah answered every question honestly and completely, but she left the session feeling drained and slightly dirty, as if the investigation was somehow validating Webb's accusations by treating them as worthy of serious consideration. That evening, Sarah attended a small dinner party at the home of Admiral Patricia Vance, a longtime mentor who had retired the previous year after a distinguished career that had included command of a carrier strike group. The gathering included several other senior female officers, both active duty and retired, who had followed the previous night's events with keen interest. Sarah, Admiral Vance said as they settled in the living room after dinner, I want you to know that what happened last night wasn't really about you. It was about the threat that your success represents to people who've built their identities around the belief that military excellence is inherently masculine. Commander Lisa Park, one of the younger officers present, leaned forward in her chair. But Admiral Chen handled it perfectly. She stayed calm, didn't take the bait, and let Admiral Webb destroy his own credibility. She did handle it well, agreed Captain Rachel Stone, but the fact that she had to handle it at all is the real problem. Male officers aren't expected to defend their fundamental right to wear the uniform. Sarah listened to the conversation with mixed emotions. She appreciated the support of her colleagues, but she was also aware that their discussion reinforced the reality that her experience was different from that of male officers in ways that extended far beyond simple professional challenges. "The investigation will clear you," Vance said confidently. "There's no question about that. But the real test will be what happens afterward. Will this incident be used as evidence that women in senior positions create problems, or will it be seen as proof that the Navy needs to do more to address persistent gender bias?" It was a question that kept Sarah awake that night as she lay in her quarters, listening to the sounds of the base settling into its nighttime rhythm. She'd worked her entire career to be judged solely on her merits, but increasingly she found herself forced to represent something larger than her individual accomplishments. The next morning brought more interviews, more questions, and more media attention. A prominent military journalist had somehow obtained details about the confrontation and published an article that portrayed it as emblematic of broader tensions within the military regarding gender integration. The article was largely sympathetic to Sarah's position, but it also amplified the controversy and ensured that the incident would be discussed far beyond naval circles. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from reporters, speaking opportunities from advocacy groups, and messages of support from officers around the world. She declined most of the requests, preferring to let the official investigation proceed without outside interference, but the attention was nevertheless overwhelming. During a brief respite between meetings, Sarah found herself in the base chapel, a small, quiet space that offered refuge from the constant scrutiny. She wasn't particularly religious, but the chapel's peaceful atmosphere provided a welcome contrast to the chaos that had consumed her life since the previous evening. She thought about her parents, who had immigrated from Taiwan when she was 5 years old. They'd sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities they'd never had themselves, working multiple jobs and living frugally to ensure their daughter could pursue her dreams. Her father had been initially skeptical about her desire to attend the Naval Academy, not because he didn't believe in her capabilities, but because he worried about the challenges she would face as a woman in a male-dominated institution. "You will have to be twice as good to get half the recognition," he'd told her during her senior year of high school. "But if you're willing to work that hard, you can achieve anything." His words had proven prophetic. Sarah had indeed worked twice as hard, achieved twice as much, and still found herself defending her right to the recognition she'd earned. But she'd also discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, developed leadership skills that served her well in crisis situations, and forged relationships with colleagues who valued competence over gender. A soft knock on the chapel door interrupted her thoughts. Lieutenant Commander Rodriguez entered quietly, her expression apologetic for the intrusion. "Admiral," she said, "Admiral Harrison's office called. The Secretary of the Navy is flying in this afternoon and wants to meet with you at 1500. Sarah nodded, though her heart rate increased slightly. A personal visit from the Secretary suggested that the incident had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership. That could be either very good or very bad for her career. "Any indication of what he wants to discuss?" she asked. "Only that it relates to the current situation and future policy considerations," Rodriguez replied. "But Admiral Harrison will be present, which suggests it's more than just a disciplinary matter." As Sarah prepared for what might be the most important meeting of her career, she reflected on the strange trajectory that had brought her to this point. 3 days ago, she'd been a successful flag officer focused on strategic challenges in the Pacific. Today, she was the focal point of a national conversation about gender equality in the military. She'd never asked to be a symbol or a representative of broader social change. She'd simply wanted to serve her country with distinction and be judged on her merits rather than her gender. But circumstances had thrust her into a position where her individual success or failure would be interpreted as evidence for or against the capabilities of all women in military service. The responsibility was daunting, but it was also clarifying. Whatever happened in the days and weeks ahead, she would face it with the same dignity and professionalism that had carried her through every previous challenge in her career. She owed that not just to herself, but to every woman who had served before her and everyone who would serve in the future. As she left the chapel and prepared to return to the demanding schedule of meetings and interviews that awaited her, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. The confrontation with Webb had been unpleasant and potentially damaging, but it had also created an opportunity to address issues that had been simmering beneath the surface of military culture for decades. She intended to make the most of that opportunity, regardless of the personal costs. The Navy was evolving, and she was determined to be part of that evolution rather than a casualty of it. Whatever Admiral Webb had intended to accomplish with his attack, he had inadvertently given her a platform to demonstrate that women belonged in positions of military leadership not as symbols or tokens, but as competent professionals who could handle any challenge with grace and effectiveness. The afternoon meeting with the Secretary of the Navy would be crucial in determining how that platform could be used constructively rather than destructively. Sarah was ready for whatever questions and challenges awaited her, confident in her abilities and secure in the knowledge that her record spoke for itself, regardless of what others chose to believe about women in the military. The Secretary of the Navy, Robert Mitchell, arrived at Naval Base San Diego aboard a government aircraft that touched down precisely at 1430 hours. Sarah Chen watched from Admiral Harrison's office window as the official motorcade made its way across the base, her stomach tight with anticipation. She'd met Secretary Mitchell twice before during routine briefings, but this would be their first substantive one-on-one conversation. "He's known for being direct," Admiral Harrison said, straightening his uniform jacket as they prepared to head downstairs. "But he's also fair. He's not coming here to conduct a witch hunt." Sarah nodded, though she wondered if Harrison's assessment was based on genuine knowledge or wishful thinking. Political appointees like Mitchell operated in a different world from career officers, one where perception often mattered more than reality and where military decisions were frequently subordinated to broader policy considerations. The meeting took place in the base commander's conference room, a formal space dominated by a mahogany table and portraits of naval heroes from throughout American history. Sarah found herself looking at the painting of Admiral Grace Hopper, the pioneering computer scientist who had fought her own battles for recognition and respect decades earlier. Secretary Mitchell was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of polished presentation that marked successful political operatives. He was accompanied by his chief of staff and a note-taker, but he dismissed them after brief introductions, leaving only himself, Sarah, and Admiral Harrison in the room. "Admiral Chen," Mitchell began, settling into his chair, "I want to thank you for taking the time to meet with me on short notice. I know this has been a challenging few days." "Thank you, Mr. Secretary," Sarah replied. "I appreciate your interest in understanding the situation." Mitchell leaned forward slightly, his expression serious. "Let me be direct with you, Admiral. What happened the other night has created political complications that extend far beyond the Navy. There are members of Congress who see this as vindication of their concerns about women in combat roles, and others who want to use it as justification for even more aggressive gender integration policies." Sarah felt a familiar frustration at the way her personal experience was being transformed into political ammunition. "Sir, if I may, this incident was about one officer's inappropriate behavior, not about broader questions of military policy." "I agree with you," Mitchell said, "but perception often matters more than reality in Washington. The question is how we manage those perceptions while maintaining focus on military readiness and effectiveness." Admiral Harrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Secretary, Admiral Chen's record speaks for itself. This incident shouldn't be allowed to overshadow her contributions to naval operations." "Absolutely," Mitchell agreed. "Which is why I'm here. Admiral Chen, I need to understand your perspective on what happened and where you think we should go from here." For the next hour, Sarah walked through the events of the gala, carefully recounting Webb's accusations and her responses. She tried to be objective, though she couldn't help but notice how clinical the recitation sounded when stripped of the emotional intensity she'd felt in the moment. "Your restraint was remarkable," Mitchell said when she finished. "Lesser officers might have escalated the situation, which would have made our current position much more difficult." "Mr. Secretary," Sarah said, "I need you to understand that restraint wasn't a tactical choice. It was simply the professional standard I hold myself to. Military officers should be able to disagree without resorting to personal attacks." Mitchell nodded thoughtfully.
tell me about the broader context. In your experience, how representative are Admiral Webb's attitudes?
It was the question Sarah had been dreading, because answering it honestly meant acknowledging uncomfortable truths about the institution she'd devoted her life to serving. But she'd built her career on integrity, and this wasn't the time to abandon that principle. "Sir," she said carefully, "I think Admiral Webb's willingness to express his views so publicly was unusual, but the views themselves are probably more common than we'd like to admit. Most officers are too professional to voice such opinions openly, but that doesn't mean they don't exist."
Can you give me specific examples? Sarah considered her response carefully.
She could think of dozens of instances where she'd sensed skepticism about women in leadership roles, the delayed responses to her orders, the tendency to question her decisions more thoroughly than those of male colleagues, the subtle exclusion from informal networks where real business was conducted. "It's usually more subtle," she explained. "Questions about whether women can handle the physical demands of combat leadership, assumptions that we're more emotional or less decisive under pressure, concerns that our presence disrupts unit cohesion. Most officers are smart enough not to say these things directly, but they influence how we're perceived and evaluated." Mitchell made notes as she spoke, his expression growing more serious.
"How has this affected your ability to command effectively?" "It's required me to be more deliberate in my decision-making and more thorough in my justifications," Sarah admitted.
"I've learned that I need to be unquestionably excellent rather than simply competent, because my failures are more closely scrutinized and my successes are more readily attributed to external factors."
"That sounds exhausting," Mitchell observed.
"It is," Sarah agreed.
"But it's also made me a better officer."
"When you know you're being watched more closely, you tend to perform at a higher level."
Admiral Harrison shifted in his seat.
"Mr. Secretary, Admiral Chen has consistently exceeded performance standards throughout her career.
Her gender hasn't been a hindrance to her effectiveness."
"I'm not questioning her effectiveness," Mitchell replied. "I'm trying to understand how we can ensure that other talented officers don't face similar challenges." They spent another 30 minutes discussing policy implications, training programs, and accountability mechanisms that might address the cultural issues the Webb incident had exposed. Sarah found herself impressed by Mitchell's grasp of the complexities involved, though she remained skeptical about whether high-level policy changes could really alter deep-seated cultural attitudes.
"Admiral Chen," Mitchell said as the meeting wound down, "I have a proposition for you.
The CNO and I have been discussing the creation of a new position, a special advisor on gender integration and leadership development. It would involve working directly with senior leadership to develop policies and training programs that address the issues we've been discussing." Sarah felt her heart skip. On one hand, it was a significant opportunity to influence positive change. On the other, it sounded suspiciously like being sidelined into a specialist role rather than being allowed to continue her operational career. "Sir," she said carefully, "I appreciate the opportunity, but I need to ask whether this would be in addition to my current operational responsibilities or instead of them."
Mitchell smiled, apparently expecting the question. "In addition to. We're not trying to remove you from operational command, we're trying to leverage your experience to improve the system for everyone."
It was an attractive offer, but Sarah knew that accepting it would fundamentally change her career trajectory. Instead of being known for her operational achievements, she would become identified primarily as an advocate for women's issues, a worthy cause, but not the legacy she'd envisioned for herself.
"Can I have some time to consider it?" she asked.
"Of course," Mitchell replied.
"Take as much time as you need. But I want you to know that both the CNO and I see this as a crucial position that requires someone with your credibility and leadership ability." After Mitchell and his entourage departed, Sarah and Admiral Harrison remained in the conference room, both lost in thought. The conversation had gone better than Sarah had expected. There had been no suggestion that she was at fault for the incident or that her career was in jeopardy. But the offer of the advisor position felt like a double-edged sword. "What's your gut reaction?" Harrison asked.
"Mixed," Sarah admitted. "It's a meaningful opportunity to create positive change, but it also feels like being placed in a box labeled women's issues."
"I didn't spend 24 years in the Navy to become a professional advocate." Harrison nodded, understanding. On the other hand, if you don't take it, who will? And would they have the credibility and operational experience to make it effective? It was a fair point.
Sarah had seen too many diversity initiatives fail because they were led by well-meaning people who lacked the respect of the operational community. Her combination of combat experience and flag rank gave her a unique platform to address these issues credibly. That evening, Sarah decided to take a long walk along the waterfront to clear her head. The base was quiet in the early evening, with only a few joggers and dog walkers sharing the path that ran along the harbor. The setting sun painted the water in shades of orange and pink, and she found the peaceful scene a welcome contrast to the intensity of the day's discussions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her younger sister, Dr. Jennifer Chen, a pediatric surgeon in Los Angeles who had followed the news coverage of the Webb incident with growing concern.
Saw the article in the Navy Times, the message read. Mom and Dad are worried. Call when you can.
Sarah smiled despite herself.
Her family had always been protective, sometimes to an almost comical degree.
When she'd first been assigned to submarine duty, her mother had called weekly to make sure she was getting enough sunlight. The idea that their eldest daughter was now the center of a national controversy about military-gender relations would probably send them into overdrive. She called Jennifer immediately, knowing that her sister would be the most direct in expressing the family's concerns.
Sarah, Jennifer said without preamble, what the hell happened?
The article made it sound like some admiral tried to destroy your career in front of half the Navy.
It was a little dramatic, Sarah admitted, but not quite that bad. Admiral Webb had too much to drink and said some things that were inappropriate. Now there's an investigation and a lot of people are trying to turn it into something bigger than it was.
Don't downplay it, Jennifer said firmly.
I read the quotes. He basically accused you of sleeping your way to the top. That's not just inappropriate, it's character assassination. Sarah found herself explaining the incident yet again, though Jennifer's perspective as a successful woman in another male-dominated profession brought new insights to the conversation. You know what's frustrating?
Jennifer said after Sarah finished her account. This guy probably assumed you'd back down or get emotional, and, when you didn't, he lost it completely. He couldn't handle being outclassed by someone he considered inherently inferior.
That's probably part of it, Sarah agreed. But I'm more concerned about what comes next.
I've been offered a position that could help address these issues systematically, but taking it might limit my operational career. Jennifer was quiet for a moment before responding.
Let me ask you something. 20 years from now, what would you regret more, not taking the chance to fix the system, or not pursuing the traditional career path you'd planned?
It was a question that cut to the heart of Sarah's dilemma. She'd always envisioned herself eventually commanding a carrier strike group or taking on other high-level operational roles. But the Webb incident had demonstrated that systemic change was needed, and she might be uniquely positioned to drive that change.
I need to think about it more, Sarah said finally.
Just don't let fear of being typecast keep you from making a real difference, Jennifer advised.
You've already proven you can excel in operational roles. Maybe it's time to prove you can excel at changing institutions too.
After ending the call, Sarah continued her walk, turning Jennifer's words over in her mind. Her sister was right that she'd already established herself operationally, her record in that regard was unassailable. But was she ready to shift focus to what amounted to a diplomatic and policy role within the military? The next morning brought news that Admiral Webb's investigation was moving quickly toward its conclusion. Multiple witnesses had provided consistent accounts of his behavior, and his own recorded statements during the incident left little room for alternative interpretations. Word through unofficial channels suggested he would face formal censure and early retirement, effectively ending his career in disgrace. Sarah felt no satisfaction at the news. Webb's destruction wouldn't solve the underlying problems that had led to his outburst, and it would probably reinforce the perception among some officers that challenging women's fitness for military service was professionally dangerous rather than simply wrong. She spent the morning reviewing intelligence reports and attending routine briefings, trying to maintain some semblance of normal duties despite the ongoing circus surrounding the investigation. But she found it difficult to focus on strategic assessments and operational planning when her own future remained so uncertain.
Admiral Harrison called just after lunch with an update on the secretary's offer. "He's serious about the advisor position," Harrison said.
"And he's willing to structure it however you think would be most effective. It doesn't have to be a traditional staff job, you could maintain your operational credentials while taking on this additional responsibility."
It was a more attractive proposition than Sarah had initially realized.
Rather than being sidelined into a purely advisory role, she could potentially maintain her operational standing while gaining influence over policy development. It would be challenging to balance both responsibilities, but it might also be an opportunity to demonstrate that addressing gender issues didn't require sacrificing military effectiveness. "What's your recommendation?" she asked Harrison.
"I think you should do it," he replied without hesitation. "Not because you owe it to anyone or because it's the politically correct thing to do, but because you're genuinely the best person for the job. The Navy needs leaders who understand both the operational requirements and the human dynamics that affect performance." That afternoon, Sarah received a call from Admiral Grace Thompson, the highest-ranking woman in naval history, who had recently been nominated for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Thompson had followed the Webb incident closely and wanted to offer her perspective. "Sarah," Thompson said, "I know you're probably getting advice from everyone with an opinion, but I wanted to share something I learned during my own career. There comes a time when you have to decide whether you want to be remembered for what you accomplished individually or for how you changed the institution." "Admiral Thompson," Sarah replied, "I've always believed that the best way to advance women's opportunities was to excel individually and let my performance speak for itself." "And you've done that brilliantly," Thompson acknowledged. "But sometimes individual excellence isn't enough to drive systemic change. Sometimes you have to be willing to take on roles that specifically address the barriers others face." It was advice from someone who had faced similar choices and had ultimately chosen to take on increasingly visible roles as an advocate for military women's advancement. Thompson's career had been groundbreaking, but Sarah knew it had also been scrutinized and criticized in ways that male officers never experienced. "The difference now," Thompson continued, "is that you'd be taking on this role from a position of strength rather than having it thrust upon you. You've proven yourself operationally, so anyone who questions your motives would be arguing from a weak position." That evening, Sarah made her decision. She called Secretary Mitchell's office and requested another meeting to discuss the advisor position in detail. If she was going to take on the responsibility of addressing gender issues within the Navy, she wanted to ensure that the role was structured to maximize its potential impact. The meeting was scheduled for the following day, and Sarah spent the evening preparing a comprehensive proposal for how the position could be most effectively implemented. She researched successful organizational change initiatives from both military and civilian contexts, identified key stakeholders who would need to be engaged, and developed metrics for measuring progress. As she worked, Sarah reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. 3 weeks ago, her biggest concern had been managing strategic challenges in the Pacific. Now she was preparing to take on a role that would require her to address some of the most deeply embedded cultural issues within the military establishment. It wasn't the career path she'd envisioned, but it was an opportunity to create lasting change that could benefit countless future officers. And, perhaps most importantly, it was a chance to transform a personal attack into a platform for institutional improvement. Admiral Webb had tried to diminish her by reducing her accomplishments to gender-based favoritism. Instead, he had inadvertently created an opportunity for her to use her platform as a successful female flag officer to address the very attitudes he'd displayed. There was a certain poetic justice in that outcome, even if the process of getting there had been unpleasant. As Sarah finalized her proposal for the advisor position, she felt a growing sense of excitement about the possibilities it represented. She would be venturing into uncharted territory, taking on challenges that were as complex as any operational mission she'd ever faced. But she was ready for those challenges, confident in her abilities and determined to prove that addressing gender issues could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. The Navy was evolving, and she intended to be a driving force in that evolution rather than a passive beneficiary of changes initiated by others. Whatever the personal costs, she was prepared to take on the responsibility of ensuring that future generations of female officers would face fewer barriers and encounter more opportunities than she had.
3 months after the gala incident, Admiral Sarah Chen stood before a packed auditorium at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, preparing to deliver her first major address as the Navy's Special Advisor on Gender Integration and Leadership Development. The audience included flag officers, senior enlisted personnel, civilian officials, and military journalists from around the world, a testament to the attention her new role had garnered. The past 90 days had been a whirlwind of policy development, stakeholder meetings, and implementation planning. Sarah had quickly discovered that her new position came with challenges she hadn't anticipated, requiring her to navigate political sensitivities while maintaining credibility with the operational community she'd spent her career serving. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, looking out at the sea of uniforms and suits, "when I accepted this position, many people asked me whether I saw myself primarily as a naval officer who happened to be working on gender issues, or as an advocate for women who happened to be in the Navy. I'm here today to tell you that this is a false choice." The opening line had been carefully crafted to address the skepticism she'd encountered from some quarters, where her appointment had been viewed as either a political gesture or an abandonment of her operational focus. Sarah had spent weeks refining her messaging to demonstrate that addressing gender integration issues was fundamentally about improving military effectiveness. Military excellence has never been about maintaining artificial barriers or limiting the talent pool from which we draw our leaders, she continued. It has always been about identifying, developing, and deploying the best people in the most effective ways possible. Gender integration isn't social engineering, it's strategic necessity. The audience was attentive but reserved, many still evaluating whether her message would be substantive policy analysis or politically motivated advocacy. Sarah knew she had to win their confidence early in the presentation if she hoped to achieve the broader influence necessary to drive real change. She clicked to her first slide, which displayed recruitment and retention statistics that painted a sobering picture of the challenges facing military leadership development. "The data tells a clear story," she explained. "We're facing unprecedented recruitment challenges while simultaneously losing experienced personnel at unsustainable rates. We cannot afford to waste talent based on outdated assumptions about who can serve effectively in various roles." Admiral Patricia Vance, who had flown in from San Francisco to attend the presentation, smiled slightly from her seat in the front row. Sarah had consulted extensively with Vance during her preparation, drawing on the older woman's decades of experience in breaking barriers and changing institutional culture. "Over the past 3 months," Sarah continued, "my team has conducted comprehensive interviews with over 200 serving personnel, from ensigns to flag officers, representing every warfare community and major command. What we've learned is that the challenges we face aren't primarily about capabilities or standards, they're about perceptions, cultural assumptions, and institutional practices that haven't kept pace with operational realities." The presentation that followed was meticulously researched and carefully balanced, acknowledging legitimate concerns while challenging unfounded prejudices. Sarah walked through case studies from allied militaries that had successfully implemented gender integration policies, demonstrated the correlation between diverse leadership teams and improved decision-making outcomes, and outlined specific recommendations for policy changes. One of her key findings had surprised even her: the most significant barriers to women's advancement weren't formal policies but informal networks and cultural practices that inadvertently excluded them from career-critical opportunities. Mentorship relationships, informal after-hours discussions where real decisions were made, and assumptions about family responsibilities all contributed to subtly different career trajectories. "Consider this example," she said, clicking to a slide that showed promotion timelines. 2 officers with identical performance records and similar assignments. Officer A receives command opportunities 18 months earlier than Officer B, not because of any formal policy difference, but because Officer A was included in informal discussions where those opportunities were first identified. Over a 20-year career, that 18-month difference compounds into fundamentally different trajectories. Captain Rodriguez, Sarah's former aide who had been promoted to work full-time on the integration initiative, watched from the side of the auditorium as the presentation unfolded. She'd been instrumental in developing the research methodologies that underpinned Sarah's recommendations, and she felt a surge of pride at seeing their work presented on such a significant platform. The question and answer session that followed was pointed but respectful. Admiral Jackson, a submarine force commander known for his traditional views, raised his hand early in the session. "Admiral Chen," he said, Your data is impressive, but I'm concerned about the practical implications of some of your recommendations.
How do we ensure that our focus on gender integration doesn't compromise our primary mission of maintaining combat readiness?
It was the question Sarah had expected, and she prepared carefully for it.
Admiral Jackson, that's exactly the right question to ask. And the answer is that we can't view this as an either-or proposition.
Combat readiness depends on having the most qualified people in the right positions, making the best decisions under pressure. Gender integration, properly implemented, enhances rather than compromises that objective.
She clicked to another slide showing performance data from integrated units. Our analysis shows that diverse teams consistently outperform homogeneous ones in complex problem-solving scenarios.
They consider broader ranges of solutions, identify risks that might otherwise be overlooked, and adapt more quickly to changing conditions.
These aren't social benefits, they're operational advantages.
The discussion continued for another hour, touching on everything from physical standards to unit cohesion to family policies. Sarah fielded each question with a combination of data-driven analysis and operational experience, gradually building credibility with even skeptical audience members. As the formal session concluded, several attendees approached the podium with follow-up questions and offers of support. General Martinez, the Marine Corps representative, was particularly enthusiastic about adapting some of Sarah's recommendations for his service branch. "Admiral Chen," he said, "your presentation has given me a lot to think about. We've been struggling with some similar issues, and your analytical framework might help us address them more systematically." It was exactly the kind of cross-service collaboration Sarah had hoped to foster. The challenges she'd identified weren't unique to the Navy, and solutions that worked across multiple service branches would be both more effective and more politically sustainable. That evening, at a reception hosted by the War College, Sarah found herself in conversation with Dr. Margaret Foster, a defense policy analyst who had written extensively about military organizational culture.
Foster had been following Sarah's appointment with great interest and had some pointed observations about the challenges ahead.
"You've made an impressive start," Foster said, "but the real test will come when you move from analysis to implementation. There are a lot of people who can live with studies and recommendations, but actual policy changes threaten established power structures."
Sarah nodded, recognizing the truth in Foster's assessment.
"What's your advice for navigating those challenges?" "Build coalitions carefully," Foster replied. "Find allies who support your goals for their own reasons rather than trying to convert people who are fundamentally opposed. And always frame your initiatives in terms of institutional benefits rather than individual grievances." It was sound advice, and it aligned with Sarah's own strategic thinking about how to approach her new role. She'd already begun identifying potential allies among senior leadership, looking for officers who were concerned about recruitment challenges, innovation gaps, or competitive disadvantages that could be addressed through better talent management. Over the following weeks, Sarah traveled extensively, visiting bases and commands across the Navy to gather additional data and build support for her initiatives. The reception varied significantly depending on the command culture and leadership personalities, but she gradually began to see patterns emerging that suggested opportunities for systematic change. At Naval Air Station Pensacola, she met with Commander Lisa Park, who had risen through the ranks as a fighter pilot and now served as an instructor at the Navy's elite flight training program. Park's experience provided valuable insights into how gender integration had evolved in one of the military's most traditionally masculine communities. "The thing people don't understand," Park told Sarah during their meeting, "is that aviation has always been about performance. When I started flying fighters 15 years ago, there were definitely guys who didn't think I belonged. But once they saw that I could fly and fight as well as anyone else, most of that resistance disappeared."
"What made the difference?" Sarah asked.
"Standards," Park replied without hesitation. "As long as everyone met the same standards and was held to the same expectations, gender became irrelevant. The problems arose when people either lowered standards to accommodate differences or created different standards for different groups." It was a perspective that Sarah heard repeatedly during her travels: the importance of maintaining rigorous, gender-neutral standards while eliminating artificial barriers that prevented qualified people from demonstrating their capabilities. The challenge was distinguishing between legitimate requirements and
traditional practices that served no current purpose. At Naval Station Norfolk, Sarah met with Master Chief Patricia Williams, whose 30-year career had spanned the transition from limited women's roles to full integration across most naval occupations. Williams provided a unique perspective on how organizational culture had evolved and where persistent challenges remained. "Ma'am," Williams told her, "the biggest changes have been in what people say out loud. 20 years ago, you'd hear openly sexist comments in most workspaces. Now that's rare, at least in mixed company. But the attitudes haven't disappeared, they've just gone underground." "How do we address attitudes that aren't openly expressed?" Sarah asked. Williams thought for a moment before responding. "Leadership, ma'am. When junior personnel see senior leaders treating everyone with respect and holding everyone to the same standards, they adjust their behavior accordingly. It takes time, but it works." The conversation reinforced Sarah's conviction that sustainable change required consistent leadership commitment rather than policy mandates alone. Cultural transformation happened through daily interactions and accumulated experiences, not through training programs or awareness campaigns. Back in Washington, Sarah worked with her small but dedicated staff to synthesize the information they'd gathered into actionable policy recommendations. The process was more complex than she'd anticipated, requiring careful coordination with multiple stakeholders and extensive legal review to ensure compliance with existing regulations. Her biggest victory came when the CNO endorsed her proposal for a comprehensive review of assignment policies that might inadvertently limit career opportunities for women. The review would examine everything from geographic limitations to family considerations to informal networking practices that affected promotion timelines. "This is exactly the kind of systematic analysis we need," the CNO told her during one of their monthly meetings. "Too often, we've tried to address these issues with piecemeal solutions that don't address underlying structural problems." Sarah appreciated his support, but she also recognized that implementation would be far more challenging than policy development. Each recommendation would require buy-in from multiple commands, many led by officers who remained skeptical about the need for change. Her breakthrough came during a visit to the USS Independence, where she observed a mixed-gender crew working with remarkable efficiency and cohesion under the command of Captain Maria Santos, one of the Navy's most respected surface warfare officers. Santos had created a command culture that emphasized performance and professional development regardless of gender, and the results were evident in everything from readiness scores to retention rates. "Captain Santos," Sarah said during a private meeting, "your command seems to have solved many of the integration challenges that other units still struggle with. What's your secret?" Santos smiled. "No secret, Admiral. Just consistent leadership and clear expectations. I tell my people that I don't care what they look like or where they came from, I care about whether they can do their jobs and help their shipmates do theirs." "But surely you've encountered resistance or challenges along the way?" "Of course," Santos acknowledged. "But I've found that most people want to be part of something successful. When they see that our approach works, that we're more effective and have better morale than units that cling to old ways of doing things, they become advocates rather than obstacles." It was an insight that would prove crucial to Sarah's strategy going forward. Rather than trying to convince skeptics through argument or mandate, she began focusing on demonstrating success through example and allowing positive results to speak for themselves. By the end of her 4th month in the advisor role, Sarah had developed a comprehensive implementation plan that balanced ambitious goals with realistic timelines. Her proposals had gained support from senior leadership and attracted positive attention from military reformers, but she knew the real test would come when policies translated into actual changes in how the Navy operated. The Webb incident, which had once seemed like a potential career disaster, had instead become the catalyst for the most meaningful work of Sarah's professional life. She was no longer just a successful individual who happened to be a woman, she had become an agent of institutional change who could help ensure that future generations of officers would face fewer barriers and encounter more opportunities. As she prepared for the next phase of implementation, Sarah reflected on how much her perspective had evolved since that difficult evening at the Hotel del Coronado. What had begun as a personal attack had transformed into a platform for addressing systemic issues that affected thousands of current and future service members. The irony wasn't lost on her that Admiral Webb's attempt to diminish her achievements had instead elevated her influence and
provided her with the opportunity to create lasting positive change. His excuses comment had inadvertently given her the chance to prove that excellence and advocacy weren't mutually exclusive, that addressing gender issues could strengthen rather than weaken military effectiveness. The journey ahead would undoubtedly present new challenges and resistance, but Sarah felt confident in her ability to navigate them successfully. She had found her new mission, and she was determined to execute it with the same precision and dedication that had characterized every previous assignment in her distinguished career. 2 years later, Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the same ballroom at the Hotel del Coronado where her confrontation with Admiral Webb had taken place, but this time the atmosphere was celebratory rather than tense. The Navy's annual leadership conference had been transformed under her influence, featuring diverse panels, innovative workshops, and frank discussions about the future of military service that would have been unimaginable just a few years earlier. The evening's keynote address was being delivered by Admiral Grace Thompson, who had recently been confirmed as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the first woman to hold the highest military position in the United States. Thompson's rise had been facilitated partly by the cultural changes Sarah's initiatives had helped implement across all service branches. 2 years ago, Thompson said from the podium, many of us wondered whether our military was ready to fully embrace the talent and capabilities of all our service members. Tonight, I can say with confidence that we're not just ready, we're leading the way for military organizations around the world. Sarah listened from her seat at the head table, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction at how far they'd come. Her position as special advisor had evolved into something unprecedented, a role that combined operational oversight with cultural transformation, strategic planning with human resource development. She'd managed to maintain her flag officer status while fundamentally changing how the Navy approached talent management and leadership development. The statistics spoke for themselves. Female officer retention rates had increased by 35%, recruitment of qualified candidates from underrepresented groups had surged, and performance metrics across gender-integrated units consistently exceeded those of traditional command structures. More importantly, the cultural changes had created a ripple effect that improved morale and effectiveness for all personnel, regardless of gender. Captain Rodriguez, now Admiral Rodriguez following her promotion to Rear Admiral, approached Sarah's table during the cocktail reception. She becomes Sarah's closest collaborator in implementing the integration initiatives, and her own rapid advancement served as evidence that the new policies were creating genuine opportunities rather than symbolic gestures. Admiral, Rodriguez said, I wanted you to see this before it becomes public tomorrow. She handed Sarah a tablet displaying a news article with the headline, Navy Leadership Model Adopted by Allied Forces Worldwide. Sarah read quickly through the article, which detailed how their gender integration framework was being studied and implemented by military organizations in Australia, Canada, the United Kingdom, and several European nations. What had begun as an internal Navy initiative was becoming a global standard for modern military leadership development. This is remarkable, Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely surprised. The international attention had been building steadily as other militaries grappled with similar challenges and sought proven solutions. There's more, Rodriguez continued.